Okay, so this video is to address the question by OpenWide333, and yes, why do you, or she, why do you believe the Bible to be factual? And so the reason I believe the Bible to be factual is we've placed the same tests that are used to determine whether other historical documents are factual. And there's three tests that there are. There's the bibliographic test, the internal evidence, and the external evidence. So I'll address the bibliographical evidence first. And so to name a couple of them, there's Thucydides' History, and that one had 8 manuscripts from the original to the latest extant copy, or the latest remaining copy. And his history was around in 400 BC, and it wasn't written down until later in 900 AD. So, pretty large gap, roughly 1,300 years, and nobody challenges that. That the history that Thucydides wrote, is factual. Caesar's history of the Gallic Wars only had 9 to 10 manuscripts, and that happened in 58 BC, and 900 AD was when it was put down. The Iliad, and the Iliad is the second most historically accurate document that we have. And it has 643 manuscripts, and the events were in 900 BC, and it was kept as a poem and all of that until it was written down in 400 BC, 500 years later. Now, the New Testament, just the New Testament alone is what I'm going to address. If we want to talk about the Old Testament, we can get into that later. But the New Testament has 20,000 manuscripts. I believe it's 8,000 of which are the Greek, and then there's more denominations of that. And the events took place in 32 AD, or 33 AD was the last, and the events were written down in 35 AD. 2 years after that. And so we're talking about something that has 31 times more manuscripts than the second most reliable document, and is 250 times more reliable in the amount of time that these events were put down. It's by the same person who actually, saw the event. And so, bibliographically speaking, the Bible is incredibly reliable. In fact, it's more reliable than any other document. Going with the Iliad, if you put those numbers into the test, it's 7,000 more times reliable than the Iliad. And so then you would go to the internal evidence. The internal evidence being, was it a first-hand account? Is it hearsay? Where did the events come from? And all or most of the events written in the New Testament are either eyewitnessed by the writer themselves or a very close friend of the writer. In the case of Paul, who was talking with Peter, Peter was the eyewitness, and he's written his things down, and then Paul, uses some of those events, knowing that Peter has seen it firsthand. Peter and Paul were very close, and when it really comes down to it, they could not afford to risk inaccuracies in their statements or willfully manipulate the facts. And if you're wondering why I'm looking down, it's because I have my notes, because I want to keep this short like I always do. And so when it comes down to it, the Jews would have gladly tried to crush the Christian movement if they could find any falsities in them. So many of the miracles that were seen by the disciples were also seen by huge enemies of the Christian movement. And that's why they bring it in. There's so many references in the New Testament where he says, you yourselves have seen them, talking to the non-believers, these events that happen. And nobody challenged it because it was true. They had seen it. They knew what was going on. Nobody could deny that, Jesus had healed blind people. He'd done all of these miracles. And the only thing that the Jews ended up going with is saying that he was, pulling blasphemy because he claimed to be God. And, he was doing these miracles in his own name. And for them, it's a serious claim because, to claim that you're God is huge, and unless you can back it up like like Jesus did, it's horrific. And they hadn't looked at the idea that, it could be backed up. They were very focused on the fact that it was blasphemy, and honestly, I can see where that's hard to go into. And so, as far as the internal evidence goes, the risk for lying for them was death. They had no choice. They could not risk an inaccuracy or manipulate, the words just a little bit to, make it seem better. In fact, even in times they would talk about Peter when he, is walking on the water. He flat out says, at one point he goes in and he's looking down at all the water and he falls and he calls out to God, and God has to, Jesus has to pick him up because he starts sinking in the water. And when they first see him in that event, they all thought he was a ghost and they were scared. You wouldn't put that in unless you had to, and they had to. They had no choice. They couldn't say, they were brave about it because they weren't. And so, the internal evidence is also likewise staggering. There's no chance for them to lie, because if they did, the Jews would have jumped on them immediately and crushed them as quick as they could. And so the external evidence is basically going in and saying, okay, what other documents do we have that either substantiate or deny these claims? And so there's a number of historians, including Eusebius, who was around in 130 AD, and his histories that he wrote, because he was a historian, they also, substantiate the claims. And so nothing that was written in the New Testament was wrong as far as what they went through. And so they've gone through and said, when this person was alive, is that when they were really alive? Did they do these things and all of that? All of the little events outside of, Jesus' life that they mention, and I don't know how outside you could really say it was. They go in and answer that. And the fact of the matter is none of them go against the actual events that happened during that time. And the next thing that I would ask is, who would die for a lie? And so you take 12 of the disciples, and not the original 12, but 12 of the later ones. Peter was crucified. Andrew was crucified. Matthew died by the sword. John was the only one who died natural death out of that. James, son of Alphaeus, was crucified. Philip was crucified. Simon was crucified. Thaddeus was killed by arrows. James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death. They literally take large rocks and killed him with stones. And he had become a leader in the church of Jerusalem and was preaching about Jesus, even though in Jesus' life he had actually mocked Jesus. Being the brother of Jesus, and him making these claims was difficult. But then after Jesus was resurrected, James knew for a fact this guy was God. And he was killed by the high priest Josephus, who was also a historian, and Josephus even includes in his histories events about Jesus. And so it substantiates not just all of the things that happened back then, but then also that Jesus was a person in that time. And Thomas was killed by the spear, Bartholomew was crucified, and James, son of Zebedee, died by the sword. Now, how many people could actually go in and say that they were going to, not just make this huge lie and this elaborate hoax and then die for it knowing it's a lie? You can't. You can't do that, because it's the moment it comes down to, dying, you're not going to just say, okay, well, I'm going to be tortured, thrown in prison, and killed knowing that what I'm doing is a lie. It would take so... you can't do that. It's way too much. And they talk about it in 2 Peter 1:16. It says, "For we did not cleverly devise tales, but were eyewitnesses to his majesty." They witnessed it firsthand. They knew. So that is why I believe it to be factual. And I have more reasons, but I'm already at 10 minutes. So, that's why I believe. That's my scientific evidence for why I believe the Bible is factual, if you will.